Welcome everybody to this episode of The Square. Today I'm with Unmesh, who won our Explore Travel Stipend program a few years back and is here to talk about his experience. Unmesh, welcome.
Thank you.
You did an episode on The Square. This isn't your first time on The Square.
Yeah, that's true. It was pandemic.
It was during the pandemic. You did it with Brandon.
It was the very first few episodes. So I think it was maybe sixth or seventh episode.
I'll link that below. Yeah, that would.
Yeah. I had long hair back then.
Yeah.
So you'll see a little bit of a change. I'm sitting in my living room, and I think Brandon was asking me questions. At that time, I had just submitted the proposal. I had won the competition, but I didn't plan at that time.
For those who don't know, Unmesh won in 2020, but was unable to go for some mysterious reason.
It's a mix of COVID and visa issues.
Right.
My own visa issues. And Corgan played a big role in actually sorting all that out, not just offering me to study and do Corgan Explore, but also helping with my visa.
Right. So you ended up getting to go a couple years later. Mm-hmm. But first, just for those who don't know, what is Explore and how, what is the Corgan Explore program?
Yep. So it's a travel study program where the firm offers a stipend. It's a fixed stipend. And when you apply for this travel study, you have to mention why you are doing this study, where you're going, what you're going to do. And then you put together an itinerary where you mention how you're going to spend that money, what the deliverables is going to be. And based on that proposal, the jury members decide who they want to select. So in that year, I got selected to go to, I selected 4 cities, New York, Paris, Barcelona, and Berlin. Those were my selections for the cities. And I was going to study specifically privately owned public spaces. That was my area of study.
So let's break that up a little bit. So you're aware of the Explore program. Mm-hmm. What is like the spark that's like, I've got it. I've got the idea. I'm going to submit my application. Take me through that, like your process there.
I kind of had the idea in my mind because I looked through all the older submissions, and there were some mentions of third space, public space, in-between space, and that always had been my area of interest. Anything outside of buildings, that kind of space, and how our designs shape that space, that in-between space. So I was looking for that niche. And the privately owned public spaces was a relatively new area. The policy has been operational for some years, but it's picking up pace in many cities, including Dallas, Houston, Austin, where there's a lot of public-private collaboration. So I saw there was some benefit to Corgan as well, because we not just build public projects, but we also work with so many private companies to get this all together. So I thought there was some mutual benefit to doing this kind of study and see those kind of spaces.
So why New York, Paris, Berlin, and Barcelona?
I would say New York was my starting point. New York has the best program in the world in terms of administering the privately owned public spaces. They have a whole set of laws around how these spaces are built, what kind of incentives they give to the developers. So they had a really robust program. They have a website where they show all these spaces.
And they have there's I know in your research there was they're registered and they have a logo, or it's like a certificate.
Exactly. So it's like on every public space, if that space is surrounding the buildings and you're entering in, there's like a placard at the start, mm-hmm. and there will be like a logo which you can see. There are all the things they have written, what you can do, what you can't do, what the timings are. It's very, very well done as a program. So that was my starting point, to see how these privately owned public spaces are done. Other cities, I would say I tried to look for opposite examples. For example, in New York, my idea was, as New York, as you know, it's like a grid, right? And in New York, you have very elongated blocks. Mm-hmm. That's the experience you get in New York, that you're walking on the path, you have a shorter side and you have a longer side. So what they have done, which I found was, sometimes they have carved out these in between spaces as a conveniences, as walkways to go through. And I thought that was a fantastic architecture, urban design concept, which I could explore as a matter of study. And what the city has done is they have collaborated with all these building blocks to set up this 6.5 Avenue, the whole street. And every building is an experience on its own.
So that it's like one cohesive in the sense that like it's
They-
not start stop. It's like you're able to go through.
True.
Now the shape and design and experience of each may be, or materiality may change, but
Right.
it's meant to kind of exist as one full.
And they did a really good thing. So there's a central park here. So from that you could start walking inside that area, and then you have your own route to craft through, where nobody else is walking as much through these areas. And then you have restaurants, and places to sit and rest. It's a very everyday kind of space. Nothing fancy, or it's not a Times Square kind of vibe. No.
Right.
It's more of everyday convenience. Someone would go from there to their offices or their train station or something like that.
And these are spaces that is working in conjunction with the city, and that like basically this is not like leftover space.
No, this is very intentional,
Yeah.
very, very intentional. This is not a residual space. In this case, the in-between space is the object where they have thought through it. Okay, how do we carve that space out? What kind of lobby you will have? And based on how good the developer of each building does, they get more incentives. If you provide a park, then you'll get 2 floors at the top for you to lease and things like that. So there's a mutually beneficial relationship which goes on in such schemes.
With such a, I guess, push by the city to incorporate that, how does that differ from the European locations that you picked, which obviously are ages older?
Right.
How does that?
Much,
How does
much
that? How does that? I guess talk about the contrast between like obviously the New York, I guess, set of organization and the European.
So I would say if New York was more from policy perspective, very regimented, and they have thought through all this, the older cities like I didn't go to London for this visit, but I went later. They also have such programs. But as these cities are historic, these places have a different connotation. For example, I'll give example of Berlin, Hackische Hofe. Hofe is courtyard in German.
HOFE.
Yeah, HOFE, and there's like a big train station. There's a very active market, and there's an old courtyard complex in that area, and that was bombed in the World War II time multiple times, and it went through so many renovations. So city used that space as an opportunity as a cultural entity. So it was owned by something else, then the ownership went through so many changes, and now city sort of co-opted that. It's still owned by a private company, but now they try to promote an artist setup, art offices in those courtyards. So courtyards in itself have some historical importance, and now you have all the art offices inside these spaces where now they're attracting all the eclectic businesses together. So the city is trying to push some sort of cultural entity through that setup. So it's not in some way everyday space like the New York was. This was more of a cultural project for them to rebuild their city and revive and maintain the historical importance of these spaces, which were badly damaged in World War II time.
As far as like the square footage, between all of ones are, I guess, are the ones in New York skewing larger than the European, or are they all roughly the same size?
I would say the Europeans one are much smaller in scale always because of the historical buildings. As all the New York buildings are new, the scale of the space is much larger. So you would imagine in New York the buildings are like, even on the bottom level, 6-story high, and then the 30-story skyscraper next to it. So even if you have like a glass roof up top, your scale is pretty big. Whereas if I think about more of a Paris or Berlin scale, it's just very typical 4-story space with a tree, and it's much more human scale for sure. because of the historical buildings. The buildings were much, much smaller.
So talk me through the trip. So you've got, as far as like logistics, I think you've, in your proposal, you've outlined, this scope and you've, set this number of deliverables. Mm-hmm. How do you execute on that?
One thing I realized, and I think this is in hindsight, I think the subject was potent enough for me to choose many other cities. I could have probably chosen a tier 2 city in every place instead of choosing these biggest cities. I think that could have been a smarter choice. In a sense, I could have found something really, really unique. But I was also worried, what if I didn't find anything?
Right.
So I was looking for more easy targets and something solid that has historical importance or some sort of typological advantage to study. Mm-hmm. But one thing I realized very quickly, like New York, it has, I think, 80 or 90 privately owned public spaces. So I knew I'm going to pick maybe one or two just as an area of focus. So that was my goal early on. I don't want to make that like I don't know what's the good word for it, travel from the standpoint of, okay, I went there and it came back. Mm-hmm. I want that to be a more rigorous exploration where I spend time there. So even in each location, I went there in the morning, evenings, in the afternoons. I came back to it again and again as a matter of study or spending time.
What was something you, in all of the spaces, like going in at different times, what are some of these surprising aspects going, beginning, how does it contrast between the morning and the afternoon?
I would say as an architect, I think I was missing that a lot when I work every day in office. I don't sometimes spend enough time on something. Everything is like in hurry because we have deadlines, we have this, we have that. I never got time to like sit still and not do much and just absorb whatever is happening. And I think that part, even on the first day I first went to New York, I realized that I'm not trying to like touch upon most destinations. I have this one goal in my mind. I'm just going to sit there and see what happens instead of pre-deciding. I think that aspect I learned in my Corgan Explore, that not pre-planning things too much. Mm-hmm. I think that's a bad idea. I think I would have stopped myself from experiencing something new if I wouldn't have given me that opportunity to like decide too much. So I would just spend like 3 hours in that stretch and just watch people. And I had few techniques to spend time. Like I would either sketch people, what they do and their movements, so that I could connect with where I am a bit more. Mm-hmm. At the same time, be in the moment and not thinking about what to do with it. That was the learning experience for me, how to spend quality time and not overanalyze it or think in future.
Well, it seems too like you got to give a little bit of room for some fun in there. So like what were some of the experiences that weren't just directly related to the research that you care to share?
Oh, the fun part was, I mean, I'm still pretty nerdy, so I'm thinking about all the things I could have studied. So one thing I started realizing, which I'm not that good at, I don't have a good grasp of fashion as a thing. I mean, I don't have a good
present wardrobe.
but in a sense, I never thought of as something, as a thing. Uh-huh. And as I spent more time just sitting there, watching people walk through, mm-hmm. doing their thing, I started observing more about fashion in general as a topic in New York versus Paris versus Berlin versus Barcelona, and how people are very different from each other in how they behave and what kind of things they wear and the projections. I thought, wow, that's a fascinating thing that I'd never noticed.
Did you come back with any? Did you go shopping? Did you get any pieces while you were there? Anything interesting?
I would say there were certainly micro trends I was watching. Like I think the blue jeans type of jacket, uh-huh. or the very specific types of shoes I was watching, especially the in women's shoes, the size of the sole,
yeah.
that got pretty thick in some areas as as something. I thought, seems like that's a thing.
Yeah.
It started popping up again and again. That there was obviously Persis was a big deal. I started watching that more, which I didn't do before, because I was just sitting there and what do I watch? I was watching everything, like what everyone is doing. And the kind of purses I saw, there was excellent amount of variety. Although I must say it was skewed in Paris sometimes, because people were there for shopping, so
Right.
they were dressed in a way to do that, because the Parisian passageways have these beautiful shops, and they sell all sorts of eclectic antique stuff and contemporary stuff. So people came there with that kind of look. So it got skewed a little bit. But that was one thing I thought, yeah, that could have been a very nice matter of study from public standpoint.
Did you find it hard to, and maybe this answered that question, but to stay present and not, like you said, like you know, not plan so much? Like,
Yeah.
was that a challenge for you to kind of?
It's always a challenge. It's always a challenge. Corey from Commercial, we did like a session together where he talks about creativity, and one thing he always speaks about in his sessions is being in the present, like not over analyzing. I had to actively stop myself from going in this spiral of over analyzing it. I got all the information about the buildings. Now it was just about sitting there and absorbing what I was feeling at that time. So that was very important.
Yeah. So what does it feel like to, you know, you're not obviously not planning too much, but maybe, you know, through your inspiration and through like the cursory research, you know, trying to find those spaces, you know, viewing them on a screen or viewing them in 2D versus like actually experiencing them. Talk about kind of the change in your perception.
Yeah, I think when I found those spaces online, I was just thinking about it from graphic standpoint. Like I was thinking, okay, New York is this very linear kind of typology of space where I'm gonna walk through this linear type of public space in between space. Berlin is courtyards, so it's gonna be a sequence of courtyards, and I walk through it. Paris is again some sort of linear aspect, but now I'm going to cross streets more, and there's a glass roof up top, so there's an experiential element to it. And Barcelona was like a totally different triangular plot piece with sculptural roof, so very interesting lighting quality. So I was looking for variety. That's what I was looking for. And what I found was what I didn't imagine well is scale. How big and small spaces make a huge difference in how it feels. I think that was something I couldn't really imagine before actually reaching there and seeing those courtyards, how a small courtyard feels versus a big courtyard feels, how every aspect of the building affects how you feel inside, the size of the windows, the awnings, what kind of expression on the texture you have. Is it like a plain wall? Is it a tiled wall? It makes a huge difference how it's going to feel. Because honestly, all these courtyards in Berlin are very similar size, but they are renovated and built on different times in all this time. So the expression is very, very different. First courtyard is this very neo-Renaissance type with lots of tiling and ornamentation. The scale completely flips because of that color and the smaller pattern. When we study architecture or when we speak, like these ideas feel like, oh yeah, if you do this, it will happen. If the pattern is smaller, this will happen. But I never like spend enough time to check that. I think that's what I learned in the travel, that I got time to stop, think, oh, this is what happens when we do all these architecture tricks.
How has that affected the work?
Not yet fully, but I would say one thing I took from my travel is soft spaces. As I spent so much time just watching people and sitting there, I started observing these kinds of patterns where, okay, when we have a building planned, we plan buildings, we have a path.
Okay.
But people always concentrate in certain areas because of some anchor points, and they form their own spheres because,
Like what would an anchor point be?
like for example, If imagine this is a plan view, and you have two courtyards connecting to each other, and there's a connector point. So you're gonna move through two spaces side by side, and what happens is, let's say you move through, and if you're waiting for someone, there's a tendency to you start occupying these spaces. You want some sort of backing for you to wait, and if there is a tree in there or something, it's a perfect anchor. You have something to go back to. But these kinds of space making elements are fantastic opportunities for any typology to use, especially long walks. You want breathers, you want alcoves, you want spaces to rest. And I think those are fantastic opportunities.
So that it doesn't just feel like this like liminal space.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
What is my purpose here? And like, do I actually exist in this in this reality?
And I think that's what I really liked about all these spaces. That New York might be a little new, but all the older spaces have gone through so much change that now it has internalized all those soft spaces and the anchor points in the design. And it works very informally, but it has certain path people move through. Yeah.
We were talking about this kind of at the beginning. Do you feel like it's the culture shaping the typology or the typology shaping the culture?
That seems like a very deep question. I don't know. After seeing all this, I feel it's like a mix. Design doesn't have that much role, especially the architecture design doesn't have that much role for specific things to happen. You can keep the typology very, very simple and similar and historic. That's okay. But the expressions, the specificity of those things matter the most. What kind of floor you have, what kind of wall fenestration you have. Those smaller details, in my view, make bigger difference than the typology itself. Sometimes, as an architect, I think we do spend a lot of time in perfecting typologies, but more than often the details make the biggest difference in how the spaces get used. That's what I found out. You can keep it very simple in terms of typology, and then work on the experiential aspects more. That's what I started feeling like.
Were there any instances where maybe those public spaces failed, I guess, in terms of implementation, right? I think you talk about, this is the idea. This is how we want. Maybe you can maybe see the architect's vision, and it not necessarily meeting that expectation when you get the public. Were there any examples of that, or?
I would say New York had most of those examples, the things which I didn't cover in my explore travel. So I focused on that 6.5 Avenue, that very narrow path, which was very well designed. So I didn't find too many issues with it. But as I said, New York has hundreds of these privately owned public spaces. There were some which were utterly useless. I mean, those were, sometimes you will see an example of a privately owned public space which is done for the sake of doing it. So you'll just have a building with a door on both sides and just tiled walls on both sides, and that's it. And the developer might have gotten some benefits out of that, just doing that. And you walk through that space and you instantly know there's nothing going on here. It is just done to get the benefit of the policy. There are examples of that, where there's a misuse of the policy.
I think like you're talking about the alcoves and things like
spending
that.
more time on it, like making sure it's useful, that kind of thing.
I think in our minds somehow there is some sort of red flag. Like that's, that whole genre on the internet of like liminal spaces, right? It's like people have kind of started to like break down like, why does this make me feel so kind of weird or gross? And I think it is because like you can kind of pretty much immediately tell like this is not a space
Yeah,
in which I need to be. It's a lot of them are like these back rooms or like these kind of transitional spaces, or I mean, even I've seen ones where it's like kind of old
There's a word for it.
abandoned malls. What is it?
It's called junk space.
Junk space.
So Rem Koolhaas in I think 1995 wrote a piece on junk spaces, and these are sort of product of escalators, elevators, and these long staircases and these connection pieces, which create the exactly kind of spaces you speak about. And Rem Koolhaas wrote like a whole piece about it. It's a fantastic piece. If you get time, you should read it.
Okay.
It describes all these non-spaces, which do not have too much quality to it, but these are transactional in nature. You just have to move through them.
Right.
Because you're going one place to another, and it just happens to be there. And it's sometimes just bare walls, no quality, nothing, and you just move through.
Which is, I think, where you start to see those opportunities for those experiential things, whether that's some sort of responsive environment, whether it's like color or sound or
we do that a lot. We start
multimedia.
thinking about, in aviation environments, that kind of thinking is very important because sometimes it's not in our hands. We had to connect big spaces to each other, and we are limited by land or limited by the positioning of the existing things. And you have these long corridors, and you have to have some level of engagement to make those spaces walkable in some way.
You talked about all those little details in a space that really separate it, not really just focusing on a simple topology, but keeping the details strong. What were the design features that you saw across all of the spaces that really were remarkable, that really kind of maybe took you back?
It's a big variety. Naturally, New York being most contemporary example, the level of ornamentation was much lower, but it was replaced with more contemporary, what I call it, decoration. Let me explain that a little bit. So ornamentation in older times, if we think about ornamentation now, it could be in form of lighting, accent lighting, which was not available in the older times. So I saw some of those techniques used for engagement in the New York setting compared to Berlin or Paris, where the vehicle to get engagement was done through materiality. So if you have a window, that window has 3 moldings inscribed in it to give it that richness needed. Whereas in New York example, you'll just have like a backlit edge with the accent, things like that. So those techniques were used a lot. So there is a case to be made for the idea of function of ornament. That you can use ornament back. You were using it back then. You're using it even now. You just have to frame it in a way what it's for. And when it's absolutely there's nothing, that's where the spaces get really, really dull and boring. I don't think it's always possible to repeat the level of richness in the historical spaces, but there are techniques or at least ideas you could use to make it comparable. I saw some of that in New York examples where the contemporary details were still fairly engaging.
Was there any, I guess, inclusion of like digital technology? I feel like in a lot of the shared spaces that I see specifically just, I mean, really, truly like in our backyard in North Texas, like I feel like every shared space is somehow being revolved around like a giant screen or, to your like Times Square example, right? Like there's some sort of maybe experiential element that has to do with like digital technology. Did you see anything like that?
The spaces specifically I saw, I didn't see that, but there was a big component of art in those public spaces, be it individual standalone art or art on the wall. There was in all the spaces there was a big component of art integration, and I'm sure there was a program to sort of get local artists involved in making of those public spaces.
So not just murals, but sculptures.
Yeah, there was a good variety in all these public spaces. That was something that was common. I would say Barcelona was very different. Barcelona was the most utilitarian space because it's a public market. So there was no fluff in that space. The whole space was a ramped concrete structure with a very sculptural roof, and it's a open market. So in the morning, people set their stuff up, and that stuff in itself is a sculpture. If you see some of the images I have, you will see how things are arranged by the people who are selling those. So that space doesn't need anything extra. That space as a market in itself has so much of sculptural quality. You don't need any architectural enhancements.
And was that a conscious decision on your part? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but Barcelona has that very much like a grid system. Then it has the same like with the courtyard, like as far as like a figure ground, right? There is like the positive and negative space that's like shared within all of the units.
Yeah, I agree. The part where I was in Barcelona, where I was actually staying, that has that very typical courtyard look. I mean, it's like so regimented. I think
that like
one of
hexagonal.
the and it was fantastic. So what happens is you have all that grid, and you know, in contemporary cities, what happens is you have these big highways coming in, and that usually breaks the grid at the end, and then you are left with these slivers. And I wanted to focus on that.
Okay.
Because I think so much study was done on these ones already. So I
Got
thought
it.
I'll pick up something which is on the fringes. And that's where they designed this beautiful public market.
So that public market was actually off of.
It's like very much off on the edge.
Yeah.
Dissected by a train line, by a main street, by a highway. And it sort of has access from three sides on a slope. And the roof sort of tries to capture that movement as well with those sort of triangulated shapes
Right.
they have in the public space.
So much so that you've got multiple entrances at multiple levels,
Yep.
but also the roof is not like a flat plane, and that it is also broken up to give some dimensionality.
Yeah. So I loved how they broke the whole regimentedness of that grid, and on the triangle they did some fantastic sculptural piece. I think these are great examples of how to deal with awkward lots when you can't really follow the same language, but you're looking to create some sort of statement maybe. And such a fantastic thing. I mean, we have always seen churches making a statement, a public court making a statement, a flea market making a statement. That's nice. I like that idea.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's original. I mean, it's just, to a less inspired municipality would make a parking lot, right? And then, some sort of revenue generator, but it's like, okay, I struggle with this as a private citizen, which is like, okay, well, what's the worth of a parking lot versus, which we've seen even in, to reference Dallas again, like we've seen like with the Parks Project, like removing some of those parking lots and maybe or older parking structures and turning them into these like shared spaces, which I think it's always an uphill battle. But I mean, just to even see, like you said, it's the chicken or the egg. It's like, well, we got to have them because if we don't have them, we can't make more. And
I think when you have enough density, enough people, it gets easier to justify such projects. But in projects like these, what they are able to convince the city is we'll put the parking underneath and build stuff up top. So you're not losing anything as such, but you're using the space better. That you have the parking you need because people are going to come, they need parking. Although in all these cities, I didn't drive or took Uber. I had already planned that I'm going to only use the public transportation. So I always either walked, biked, or used the bus or train in all these cities. And it was possible on the cities, so it didn't stop me from keep using it. Yeah.
In discussing some of the spaces that you visited, you talked about maybe how some of them were constructed through or during multiple spans of time. What is your impression on how to make those spaces more resilient to changes in the use or community? Like, how do you make them more reliable over time? not from like a weather perspective, but like to know that like, okay, well, if this was made in the, fall of 2024, in 10 years, to be able to make sure that that use is sustained and is still kind of meeting the demand of the community?
That's a hard one.
That's why I asked the
Yeah.
question. I knew it was a hard question.
I would say, yeah, that's tough. The easy answer is having column-free spaces. Columns usually create some sort of barriers in the future use. But I think the idea of soft spaces is powerful for any of the planning of buildings. I think even Corgan has done some fantastic studies of building parking structures, thinking about if they can be used later for offices. But the problem,
We just did an episode on that, which you
so-
can see. I will actually link that below so that you can watch it.
Yeah, I think these are the kinds of ideas we have to explore. The only hard part to make any of these ideas work is the upfront investment to make both typologies work. Because one typology in itself will be cheaper to build, but if you're incorporating 2 or 3 things together, it's going to have some upfront cost. So honestly, any of the structures which they're reusing were not meant to be reused. They're just making it work. They're being very adaptable. There are some hidden advantages of working with what we have. I'll give an example of what they are doing in Paris passageways or Berlin's Hackesche. So if you think about any financial instrument of like a rental space and things like that, you might feel, okay, Kroger needs this much big space to have a mini grocery or a full size grocery. And if you keep building these big buildings to make that happen, but as you're working with smaller space, you are going to attract a smaller grocery. You are going to attract a smaller artist studio. You are going to attract an artist who is up and coming, who could afford that small of a rent. So having those scales sometimes can be used as an advantage to you. Whereas a new building, you won't build it like that because it's financially not that viable. So as they had the goal to make that building work, they attracted the right kind of people to come there who are up and coming, who had the eclectic taste to get there and accommodate and make something unique out of it. If you have a triangular lot, something interesting is going to happen. So it sort of leads one another. If you're dealing with a creative constraint, you're going to get a fantastic output.
So besides, I think, the emphasis on soft spaces like you recommended, I guess, what advice do you have to those with interest in supporting these privately owned public spaces? I guess, how do we see more of these? How are we to engage in them better, longer, more?
We just have to be active and keep sharing our thoughts. And one thing, and this is my personal opinion a little bit, as we are accepting more private ownership of spaces for all, we also have to make sure that these spaces are accessible to actually all the people and not just people who dress in certain way and not dress in certain way. And those spaces shouldn't be a vehicle to discriminate. I think that's something we have to take an active effort to make sure that it's for all. And if you see something which you think it's not appropriate, like there's so much hostile architecture I saw. If you have seen the category hostile architecture, it's all the furniture which has furniture which is designed actively to stop people from sitting there or sleeping there and things like that. I don't think these are good examples of supporting each other. What kind of value it promotes? It says, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And cities spending money to make it not be used in certain way. I think we have to be a bit more we have to voice our opinion on that and make city known that this is not the place we want to spend money. Instead, making better spaces for all and more. I think that's something we could do together and just use those spaces more. Even in Dallas, we have so many parks, Houston, Austin, as we have so many offices around, just going out and using that. spaces would be awesome. I think that would be the best thing we could do.
How does just traveling change you as a person?
I think I always thought my work won't improve without travel because uh, internet sort of distorts your view on things, and it becomes some sort of a weird copy paste exercise where everybody's insights converge. But if you travel, there's a little bit of chance maybe you will have something unique which only you know because you saw it and you absorbed it. I think that's what I'm looking for. So I'm like, I can't be a great designer if I don't have original insights. And how will I get those? If I don't do something unique on my own, it won't happen. So I think we have to travel. We have to travel to be open to something new, which only we know, something special we bring in to work. So that's why I love this program. I think it's a very unique program. I don't think I have heard any other firm doing such kind of program with such consistency. We have been doing it from 2015 or something. That's fantastic. I think that's what's gonna give us that creative edge when we are in the team, that someone comes in with an idea which they saw in their travel experience, which was supported by Corgan. I think that's perfect. That's what we want to do.
I definitely agree, because you have the the Instagram versus reality, right? Where they'll show all of these incredibly picturesque vantage points, and then they'll show you maybe that's what actually that was taken at 5 o'clock in the morning in the middle of winter. This is what it looks like at noon in the summer, and it's like it's a completely different experience, right? And so much of I think what the travel is this. This sounds so stupid. It's not the destination; it's the journey.
Yeah.
But it really is like getting there, or having that act of removing yourself from your daily ritual.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's a reset. So it really doesn't even matter. Like in all of the travel that I've done, which is not a lot. Those instances where I'm removed kind of from myself almost, and you're almost kind of playing a part as...
And screen time, you have to get the screen time down.
It's true. The screen time, it drops, but then it's also up, because you're like, the thing I struggle with is like definitely staying.
You can use the camera and
You
stuff,
can use the camera.
but
I will
the
definitely...
social aspect has to get down to zero at that time.
Yes.
Because it's gonna hinder your ability to...
It peaks and valleys, and I think...
in that moment.
Yeah, definitely one thing I struggle with. It's less about being present, and it's more about not worrying so much about capturing like it in its purest essence.
Yeah, and also not thinking too much about the destinations after whatever you're gonna do. That's what stops you usually from making the most of that experience. Let's say if you are like time bound, I have to go here after here after. That's like I have stopped doing that. I don't do that anymore. I have less things on my travel schedule so that I could be like fully immersed in whatever I'm doing. I used to do like fully packed travel schedules. Like I do this at 1 o'clock and then 3 o'clock, then 5 o'clock. It's very painful. I'm not gonna do that anymore. And that happened after Corgan Explore. I finally understood, okay, this is how I should always travel. I pick up one thing and I give myself a lot of room to stay in that space and not like just move around frantically, just touching every destination I go.
Right.
And I need to stop doing that.
It's not a checklist.
And that's what happened on Corgan Explorer. I realized, okay, this is how I should travel every time now after this. And that completely changed how I and my wife, we both travel now. And by the way, she was there with me throughout the travel. So she's an architect as well. So she helped me so much in documentation and sketching with me and things like that. It was fantastic.
Unmesh, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate all of your insights and your time and sharing your trip with us.
Awesome. Thank you so much.